The Antebellum Mansion at 1847, Rutledge Avenue in Charleston's prestigious Garden District still bears the scars of what locals call the summer that broke the South. If you drive past it today, you'll notice something unsettling about the pristine white columns and perfectly manicured azaleas. Every window on the third floor has been bricked over, sealed permanently after what investigators found there in 1925. The city council voted unanimously to ensure those rooms would never be opened again, but they never explained why to the public. What happened in that house between June and September of 1878 claimed the lives of 6 men, all connected to the same woman, all dying under circumstances so similar that modern forensic experts still study the case files. The victims showed identical symptoms in their final days: violent tremors, blackened fingernails, and the telltale sweet almond scent that clings to the breath of arsenic poisoning victims. But here's what makes this case truly terrifying: the killer didn't work alone. Before we dive into the story of Victoria Beaumont and the Charleston poisoning circle, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this one get buried by powerful families who spend generations covering their tracks, and we're here to make sure the truth finally sees daylight. Drop a comment and let us know what city you're watching from. We've had viewers from all 50 states share their own local ghost stories and historical mysteries, and your insights always help us uncover new angles on these buried crimes. The real horror of what happened at the Beaumont Mansion only came to light in 1925, when contractors renovating the servants' quarters discovered a hidden vault behind the kitchen pantry. Inside that vault were detailed journals, photographs, and correspondence that revealed a conspiracy so shocking that the Charleston Police Department classified the files and refused to release them for 40 years. What those documents contained was evidence of the most methodical murder spree in South Carolina's history, orchestrated by a woman whose beauty and charm made her the toast of Charleston society, even as she systematically eliminated anyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. Charleston, in the summer of 1878, was a city still recovering from the devastation of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The old plantation aristocracy was desperately trying to maintain their social positions while secretly struggling with financial ruin. Grand mansions that had once hosted lavish parties now stood half-empty, their owners selling family heirlooms to pay for basic repairs. It was in this atmosphere of faded gentility and quiet desperation that Victoria Beaumont emerged as one of the most fascinating and dangerous figures in the city's history. Victoria was 28 years old in 1878, a widow who had inherited her late husband's import business along with enough money to maintain the lifestyle that Charleston society expected from someone of her station. She was tall and elegant, with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper and green eyes that seemed to see straight through to people's deepest secrets. Those who knew her described her as mesmerizing rather than conventionally beautiful, possessed of an almost supernatural ability to make any man feel as though he were the only person in the room worth her attention. The Beaumont Mansion was a testament to Victoria's impeccable taste and seemingly unlimited resources. Built in the 1820s by her late husband's grandfather, it featured 3 stories of pristine white marble, wraparound verandas that caught every breeze from Charleston Harbor, and gardens that were the envy of every hostess in the city. The house was always perfectly appointed, staffed with well-trained servants, and maintained at a level that suggested the Beaumont family fortune had survived the war intact. What Charleston society didn't know was that Victoria's apparent wealth was largely an illusion, supported by increasingly desperate schemes that required her to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Victoria's daughters represented everything she was fighting to preserve. Isabella, 22, was the acknowledged beauty of Charleston's younger set, with her mother's striking coloring and a gentle disposition that made her popular with both men and women of good society. Her younger sister, Cordelia, 20, possessed a sharper intelligence and stronger will that occasionally worried Victoria, who preferred daughters who could be easily controlled and directed toward advantageous marriages. The Beaumont financial situation was far more precarious than anyone suspected. Victoria's husband had died 3 years earlier under circumstances that the family doctor had attributed to yellow fever, but which had actually been the result of careful arsenic poisoning administered over several months. His death had provided Victoria with temporary financial relief, but his business debts and bad investments were gradually consuming the inheritance. She understood with cold clarity that her daughters' marriages were her only hope of maintaining their social position, but finding suitable husbands required her to continue projecting an image of wealth and stability that grew more expensive to maintain with each passing month. It was against this backdrop of hidden desperation that Isabella announced her engagement to James Whitmore, a 30-year-old attorney from a prominent Savannah family. James possessed everything the Beaumonts needed: youth, ambition, connections to Georgia textile money, and most importantly, a trust fund that would become accessible upon his marriage. He was handsome in a classical Southern way, with dark hair, aristocratic features, and the kind of courtly manners that made older women feel charmed and younger women feel treasured. His law practice was thriving, his family's political connections suggested a future in state government, and his obvious devotion to Isabella convinced everyone that the match was based on genuine affection rather than financial calculation. The engagement, announced in May 1878, was celebrated throughout Charleston as a perfect union between two of the South's most respected families. James was clearly infatuated with Isabella, writing her passionate letters filled with poetry and promises of eternal devotion. Isabella, though more reserved in her expressions of feeling, seemed genuinely happy with the arrangement and eager to begin planning their October wedding. Victoria threw herself into the preparations with an intensity that impressed even Charleston's most demanding society matrons, personally overseeing every detail from the selection of Isabella's trousseau to the design of the wedding invitations. What no one in Charleston society understood was that Victoria's enthusiastic welcome of James into the family stemmed from something far more calculating than maternal joy. From their first meeting, she had recognized in James not just a solution to her financial problems, but an opportunity to secure her family's future permanently. His legal expertise could help her navigate the complex web of debts and obligations that threatened to destroy them, while his family connections could open doors that had been gradually closing as rumors about the Beaumont finances began to circulate among Charleston's more observant socialites. But Victoria's plans for James went far beyond using his money and connections to solve her immediate problems. She had begun to develop a comprehensive strategy that would eliminate all threats to her security permanently, and James's unwitting cooperation would be essential to making that strategy work. The first phase involved seducing James away from Isabella, not because Victoria felt any genuine attraction to him, but because she needed him completely under her control before she could move to the next phase of her plan. Victoria's seduction of James began subtly, with seemingly innocent conversations about family history and financial planning that gradually revealed her sophisticated understanding of business and legal matters. She positioned herself as someone who appreciated his intelligence and ambition in ways that Isabella, despite her beauty and charm, simply couldn't match. Their discussions took place during James's increasingly frequent visits to the Beaumont mansion, where Victoria made sure that she and James often found themselves alone together while Isabella was occupied with social calls or charitable activities. The first sign that Victoria's campaign was succeeding came during a dinner party in early June, when several guests noticed the intensity with which James listened to Victoria's opinions on political and economic matters. While Isabella chatted with other young ladies about fashion and social gossip, James hung on every word Victoria spoke about the challenges facing the South's recovering economy. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew to the parlor and the gentlemen remained for cigars and brandy, several of James's friends commented on his obvious fascination with his future mother-in-law. By mid-June, Victoria's influence over James had become unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. He began seeking her advice on legal matters related to his practice, consulting her about investment opportunities, and spending long hours in her study discussing books and ideas that Isabella had never shown any interest in exploring. Victoria was careful to maintain perfect propriety during these conversations, but there was an undeniable intimacy in the way she spoke to James, as though they shared secrets and understanding that excluded everyone else, including Isabella. The transformation in James's behavior toward Isabella was gradual but noticeable. While he remained courteous and affectionate, there was a distracted quality to his attention that hadn't been present before. Isabella mentioned to Cordelia that James seemed preoccupied during their private conversations, often staring off into space or bringing up topics that seemed to have nothing to do with their engagement or future together. When Isabella tried to discuss wedding plans, James would nod and agree but showed little of the enthusiasm he had displayed earlier in their engagement. What Isabella didn't know was that Victoria had begun adding small amounts of a mild sedative to James's evening brandy during his visits to the mansion. The doses were carefully calculated to lower his inhibitions and make him more susceptible to suggestion without causing any obvious symptoms that might raise suspicions. This pharmaceutical manipulation, combined with Victoria's psychological seduction, was gradually breaking down James's emotional attachment to Isabella and replacing it with a dangerous obsession with her mother. The seduction reached its crucial turning point on the night of June 23, 1878, during a thunderstorm that kept James at the mansion overnight rather than attempting the dangerous ride back to his hotel in downtown Charleston. Victoria had arranged for Isabella to be visiting friends that evening, ensuring that she and James would be alone in the house except for the servants, who had been given strict instructions not to disturb their mistress after 10 o'clock. Victoria found James in the library, ostensibly reading but actually staring out at the lightning that illuminated Charleston harbor in brilliant white flashes. She was wearing a silk dressing gown that emphasized her figure while maintaining the pretense of modesty, and she carried 2 glasses of the brandy that James had come to expect during their evening conversations. The sedative in his glass was stronger than usual, calculated to lower his resistance to the dangerous conversation Victoria was about to initiate. "You seem troubled, James," Victoria said, settling into the chair beside his with a graceful motion that drew his attention to her bare throat and the way her auburn hair fell across her shoulders. "Surely not by thoughts of marriage to my daughter." James accepted the brandy gratefully, though he noticed that Victoria's proximity filled his senses with her distinctive perfume, a combination of jasmine and something else he couldn't identify that made his pulse quicken in ways that seemed inappropriate for his relationship with Isabella's mother. "Not troubled exactly," he replied, taking a sip of the excellent brandy. "Just thinking about the future, about whether I'm worthy of Isabella's love and trust." Victoria moved closer, close enough that he could see the intelligence glittering in her green eyes and feel the warmth radiating from her body. "Worthiness is a curious thing," she said softly. "Sometimes we think we know what we deserve, what we want, but life has ways of showing us truths we never expected to discover." The conversation that followed revealed James's deepest insecurities and desires with a precision that should have alarmed him. Victoria learned about his fears regarding his legal career, his doubts about his ability to provide the kind of life Isabella deserved, and most importantly, his growing sense that his engagement was based more on social expectations than genuine passion. With each revelation, Victoria positioned herself as someone who understood him in ways that Isabella never could, someone who appreciated his intelligence and ambition without the naive idealism that made Isabella charming but intellectually limited. What James didn't realize was that Victoria had been studying him for weeks, reading his correspondence with Isabella to understand his personality, making discreet inquiries about his family's finances, and observing his habits and preferences with the methodical attention of a predator studying prey. The sedative in his brandy was making him more talkative and emotionally vulnerable than he would normally be, while Victoria's carefully planned conversation was breaking down his psychological defenses with surgical precision. That night, Victoria made her first direct move toward seducing James. It was subtle but unmistakable, a hand placed on his arm to emphasize a point, a laugh that lingered just long enough to suggest intimacy, a compliment about his intelligence delivered with a look that spoke of deeper appreciation. James, already compromised by the drugged brandy and confused by the emotional intimacy of their conversation, found himself responding despite his engagement to Isabella and his better judgment. "I've always admired intelligence in a man," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made James lean closer to hear her words. "Isabella is a sweet child, but she doesn't appreciate the complexity of your mind the way someone with more experience might." The implications of Victoria's words hung in the air between them like a challenge. James struggled to maintain appropriate boundaries, but the combination of the sedative, Victoria's perfume, and the electric atmosphere created by the thunderstorm made clear thinking impossible. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said slowly, "I'm not sure this conversation is entirely appropriate." Victoria's smile was enigmatic and dangerous. "Appropriateness is often the enemy of truth, James. Some conversations can only happen when we're willing to set aside social conventions and speak honestly about what we really want." The seduction didn't reach its conclusion that night. Victoria was far too intelligent to rush such a delicate operation. Instead, she withdrew just as James seemed ready to cross a line that would compromise his engagement irrevocably, leaving him frustrated and guilty, unsure of what had almost happened but certain that his relationship with Victoria had moved into dangerous territory. She had planted seeds of desire and confusion that would grow over the following days, gradually eroding his commitment to Isabella and replacing it with an obsession that would make him vulnerable to manipulation. Isabella, spending the night at her friend's house to avoid traveling in the storm, never suspected that her engagement had been fundamentally altered during those hours she was away from the mansion. When she returned the following morning, she found James having breakfast with Victoria, both of them perfectly proper in their behavior but sharing a subtle intimacy that excluded Isabella despite her presence at her own family's table. Over the following weeks, James's behavior became increasingly erratic. He continued to visit the mansion regularly, but his attention was clearly focused on Victoria rather than Isabella. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate, while his interactions with Isabella became stilted and uncomfortable. Isabella noticed that James seemed distracted during their time together, often bringing up topics that Victoria had discussed with him, as though her mother's opinions had become more important to him than her own. The crisis came in early July when Isabella confronted James about his obvious fascination with Victoria. The conversation took place in the mansion's rose garden, where Isabella had hoped the romantic setting might help her re-establish the emotional connection that seemed to be slipping away from their engagement. "James," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing anxiety, "I feel as though you're becoming a stranger to me. We used to talk for hours about our future together, but now you seem more interested in discussing philosophy and business with my mother than planning our wedding with me." James's response revealed the extent to which Victoria's manipulation had succeeded in reshaping his feelings. Instead of reassuring Isabella about his commitment to their engagement, he became defensive and critical, suggesting that Isabella's concerns were evidence of immaturity and jealousy that proved she wasn't ready for marriage to someone with serious intellectual interests. "Your mother understands things about the world that you've never had to consider," James said, his tone condescending in a way that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "Perhaps if you took more interest in subjects beyond fashion and social gossip, you would be better equipped to support a husband who has ambitions beyond attending tea parties and charity functions." Isabella was stunned by the cruelty in James's voice and the obvious comparison he was making between her and Victoria. She realized with growing horror that her fiancé had fallen under her mother's influence in ways that threatened not just their engagement, but Isabella's understanding of her place in her own family. The man she had agreed to marry was becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone whose loyalty had been transferred from her to Victoria through means she couldn't begin to understand. That night, Isabella made a decision that would put her life in immediate danger. She decided to confront Victoria directly about her relationship with James and demand an explanation for the obvious manipulation that was destroying Isabella's engagement. What Isabella didn't know was that Victoria had been expecting this confrontation and had already prepared for it in ways that would eliminate the threat Isabella posed to her plans permanently. The confrontation took place in Victoria's private study, a room that Isabella rarely entered but which had become James's favorite place in the mansion for his increasingly intimate conversations with her mother. Victoria was seated behind her mahogany desk, reviewing what appeared to be business correspondence, when Isabella knocked on the door and requested a private conversation. "Of course, my dear," Victoria said, her voice warm and motherly despite the coldness in her green eyes. "Please, sit down. You look troubled." Isabella took the chair across from her mother's desk, the same chair where James had sat for countless hours while Victoria systematically destroyed his emotional attachment to his fiancé. "Mother," Isabella began, trying to keep her voice steady, "I need to ask you directly about your relationship with James. Something has changed between you, something that's affecting my engagement in ways I don't understand." Victoria's expression remained perfectly composed, though Isabella caught a flicker of something dangerous in her mother's eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, Isabella. James and I have developed a friendship based on mutual intellectual respect. Surely you wouldn't want your fiancé to dislike your family." "It's more than friendship," Isabella replied, her voice growing stronger as her anger overcame her fear. "James talks about you constantly, quotes your opinions on everything from politics to literature, and seems to value your approval more than mine. He's changed completely since he's been spending time with you, and I want to know what you've done to make him lose interest in our engagement." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Isabella saw her mother's mask of maternal concern slip for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. When Victoria spoke again, her voice carried a warning that made Isabella's blood run cold. "You're imagining things, my dear child," Victoria said, rising from her chair and moving around the desk with predatory grace. "James is simply maturing, developing interests and perspectives that require a more sophisticated understanding than you currently possess. Perhaps instead of accusing me of impropriety, you should consider whether you're truly ready for marriage to a man of his caliber." Isabella realized with growing horror that her mother was not going to deny the manipulation, but was instead suggesting that Isabella was inadequate to hold James's interest. The cruelty of this approach, combined with Victoria's obvious lack of maternal concern for Isabella's feelings, revealed a side of her mother that Isabella had never seen before. "You've seduced him," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My own mother has seduced my fiancé, and you're trying to make me believe it's my fault for not being sophisticated enough to keep him interested." Victoria's smile was cold and satisfied. "Seduction is such a crude word, Isabella. I've simply shown James what it means to have conversations with a woman who can match his intelligence and understand his ambitions. If that's made him realize that his engagement was based on infatuation rather than genuine compatibility, Perhaps you should thank me for preventing a marriage that would have made you both miserable." The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of Victoria's manipulation and her complete lack of concern for Isabella's well-being. Victoria explained with chilling matter-of-factness that James had become essential to her plans for securing the family's financial future, plans that required his complete loyalty and cooperation. Isabella's continued presence as his fiancé was an obstacle that needed to be eliminated, and Victoria had chosen seduction as the most efficient method of breaking their engagement without creating a scandal that might damage the family's social standing. What Victoria didn't tell Isabella was that she had already decided that James himself would need to be eliminated once he had served his purpose in helping her access his family's money and legal connections. James's obsession with Victoria made him useful in the short term, but his emotional instability and guilty conscience made him too dangerous to be allowed to survive long term. Victoria's plan called for James to suffer a tragic accident shortly after she had gained control of his finances, leaving her as a grieving woman who had found comfort with her late daughter's fiancé after losing Isabella to a similar accident. Isabella's reaction to her mother's revelations was a mixture of horror, anger, and disbelief. She threatened to expose Victoria's manipulation to James, to their friends and family, and to anyone else who would listen. This was exactly the response Victoria had been expecting, and she was prepared for it. "I wouldn't advise that course of action," Victoria said, returning to her seat behind the desk and opening the drawer that contained the small revolver she kept for protection. "James is completely under my influence now. If you try to convince him that I've manipulated him, he'll simply report your accusations to me, and I'll be forced to take measures to protect myself and my reputation." The implied threat was unmistakable, and Isabella realized with crystalline clarity that her mother was capable of violence if her plans were threatened. She also understood that she was now living in a house with a woman who viewed her as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a daughter to be protected. Isabella spent the next several days in a state of controlled terror, trying to maintain normal behavior while secretly preparing to escape from the mansion and seek help from authorities who might be able to protect her from her mother's plans. What she didn't know was that Victoria had already begun adding small amounts of arsenic to Isabella's food, testing her daughter's tolerance for the poison that would eventually kill her. The headaches and nausea that Isabella had been experiencing for the past week weren't symptoms of stress from her deteriorating engagement. They were the early stages of arsenic poisoning, carefully administered by a mother who had decided that her daughter's life was an acceptable price to pay for financial security. Isabella's first concrete evidence of her danger came when she discovered Victoria and James in the mansion's wine cellar, standing close together and speaking in urgent whispers over a bottle that clearly wasn't intended for dinner. When they noticed her approach, both fell silent with expressions of guilt and conspiracy that confirmed Isabella's worst suspicions about their relationship. "We were selecting wine for tonight's dinner," Victoria explained smoothly, though Isabella noticed that neither of them was actually holding the bottle anymore. "James has developed such refined taste since he's been spending time with our family." Isabella smiled and accepted the explanation, but she secretly observed that the bottle they had been examining was covered in dust and clearly from Victoria's private collection, the expensive vintages that were reserved for special occasions. More importantly, Isabella was certain she had seen James slip something small into his jacket pocket just before she appeared. That evening at dinner, Isabella paid careful attention to every detail of the meal and her family's behavior. She noticed that Victoria served the wine personally, pouring from a bottle that seemed different from the one they had been examining in the cellar. She also noticed that James seemed unusually nervous, dropping his fork twice and spilling water on the tablecloth with trembling hands. Most significantly, Isabella noticed that both Victoria and James barely touched their own food, while encouraging Isabella to eat heartily and complimenting the cook on dishes that Isabella had never particularly enjoyed. The combination of their behavior, James's obvious nervousness, and her own recent symptoms led Isabella to a conclusion that filled her with horror. They were poisoning her. Isabella began avoiding meals whenever possible, claiming that excitement about the approaching wedding was affecting her appetite. She also started carrying a small vial with her at all times, secretly collecting samples of anything she was encouraged to eat or drink. Her plan was to take these samples to a doctor or pharmacist who might be able to test them for poison, providing evidence that could be used to expose Victoria's crimes and protect Isabella from further attempts on her life. The opportunity for escape came on the night of July 15th, when both Victoria and James retired early after what appeared to be an argument about timing and methods that Isabella had overheard from the next room. She waited until she was certain both were asleep, then gathered her evidence and a small bag of essential items before slipping out of the mansion through the servants' entrance. Isabella's destination was the home of Dr. Henry Morrison, the family physician who had attended her father during his final illness 3 years earlier. Dr. Morrison was one of the few people in Charleston who might be willing to believe her accusations against Victoria and who possessed the medical knowledge necessary to test her samples for poison. Isabella had made it halfway across the mansion's grounds when she heard footsteps behind her and realized that someone was following her through the darkness. She turned to see James approaching, carrying a lantern and wearing an expression that combined desperation with something that looked almost like madness. "Isabella," James called out, his voice strained and urgent. "Where are you going at this hour? Your mother sent me to find you when she discovered you weren't in your room." Isabella realized that her escape attempt had been discovered, and that James was now actively participating in Victoria's plans to prevent her from seeking help. The man she had once planned to marry was now her captor, willing to use force if necessary to keep her from exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed their engagement and put her life in danger. "I couldn't sleep," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice steady while calculating her chances of outrunning James in the darkness. "I thought some fresh air might help with my headaches." James moved closer, and Isabella could see in the lantern light that his eyes held the same cold calculation she had seen in Victoria's face during their confrontation. The transformation was complete. James was no longer the honorable young man who had courted her with poetry and promises of eternal devotion. He had become Victoria's accomplice in a scheme that would require Isabella's death to succeed. "Your mother is very worried about you," James said, reaching out to take Isabella's arm with a grip that was firm enough to prevent escape. "She thinks you might be suffering from some kind of nervous condition that's affecting your judgment. Perhaps it would be best if you came back to the house and let her take care of you." Isabella realized that resistance would be useless. James was stronger than she was, and calling for help would only alert Victoria to her escape attempt before she could reach safety. Her only option was to return to the mansion and wait for another opportunity, though she understood that Victoria would be more careful about watching her after this failed attempt. The next morning brought news that confirmed Isabella's worst fears about her mother's plans. Dr. Morrison was found dead in his study, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Isabella understood that Victoria had somehow learned about her plan to seek help from the doctor and had eliminated him before he could examine the poison samples or provide protection for Isabella. With Dr. Morrison dead and James completely under Victoria's control, Isabella realized that she was effectively trapped in the mansion with two people who were planning to kill her. Her only hope was to find some way to escape Charleston entirely, but that would require resources and connections that she didn't possess without help from family or friends who might themselves become targets if they tried to assist her. Victoria's solution to the problem of Isabella's continued resistance was elegantly simple and absolutely monstrous. That afternoon, she announced to Charleston society that Isabella had been showing signs of mental instability, probably brought on by the stress of planning her wedding. As a concerned mother, Victoria had consulted with several physicians who recommended that Isabella be sent away for treatment at a private sanatorium where she could recover her health away from the pressures of social expectations. The sanatorium Victoria had selected was located in the mountains of North Carolina, a remote facility that specialized in treating wealthy women whose families preferred to handle their mental health problems discreetly. What made this particular institution perfect for Victoria's needs was its reputation for having patients who arrived but never recovered sufficiently to return home, dying in the mountain air from complications of their various conditions. Isabella's commitment to the sanatorium was scheduled for the following week, giving Victoria time to complete the financial arrangements that would transfer Isabella's inheritance to Victoria's control and to finalize the plans for James's own elimination once he had served his purpose in signing the necessary legal documents. What neither Victoria nor James anticipated was that Isabella had one ally they had overlooked, Cordelia, whose sharp intelligence had allowed her to observe the family's interactions with growing suspicion. Cordelia had noticed Isabella's deteriorating health, James's strange behavior, and Victoria's increasing control over both of them. Most importantly, Cordelia had overheard enough conversations to understand that Isabella was in mortal danger and that seeking help from local authorities would be useless given Victoria's social connections and reputation for respectability. Cordelia's plan for saving Isabella was desperate but potentially effective. Instead of trying to expose Victoria's crimes to Charleston society, which might not believe accusations against such a respected woman, Cordelia decided to contact authorities in Savannah who might be willing to investigate suspicious deaths connected to the Beaumont family. Her goal was to gather enough evidence to prove that Victoria had murdered their father and was planning to kill Isabella, evidence that could be presented to law enforcement officials who had no social or financial reasons to protect Victoria's reputation. The plan required Cordelia to search the mansion for physical evidence of Victoria's crimes while pretending to maintain normal family relationships. What Cordelia discovered during her secret investigation exceeded her worst fears about her mother's activities. Hidden throughout the mansion were supplies of arsenic, detailed notes about poison dosages and symptoms, and most horrifying of all, a journal that documented Victoria's systematic murder of not just their father, but several other men who had posed threats to her security over the years. Victoria's journal revealed her to be far more dangerous than even Isabella had suspected. The entries, written in Victoria's precise handwriting, describe her crimes with clinical detachment, noting which methods worked most effectively and which caused suspicion that needed to be managed. The journal also contained detailed plans for future murders, including Isabella's death at the sanatorium and James's eventual elimination once his usefulness had ended. Cordelia's discovery of the journal should have provided the evidence needed to expose Victoria and save Isabella, but it also put Cordelia herself in immediate danger. Victoria had been monitoring both her daughter's activities more carefully since Isabella's escape attempt, and she quickly realized that Cordelia had found the hidden evidence. The confrontation came on the morning of July 20th, when Victoria discovered Cordelia copying pages from the journal in preparation for taking the evidence to authorities in Savannah. Victoria's reaction revealed the full extent of her ruthlessness and her complete lack of maternal feeling for her daughters. "I'm disappointed in you, Cordelia," Victoria said, her voice calm despite the fury in her green eyes. "I had hoped that you were intelligent enough to understand the necessity of what I've done to protect our family, but it seems you're as naive as your sister." Cordelia looked up from the journal pages she had been copying, meeting her mother's gaze with a courage that surprised them both. "I understand perfectly," she replied. "You've murdered our father and at least 5 other men, you're planning to kill Isabella, and you've turned her fiancé into your accomplice. The only thing I don't understand is how you can call any of this protection when you're destroying the people you claim to love." Victoria moved closer to where Cordelia sat at the desk, and Cordelia could see that her mother was carrying something concealed in the folds of her mourning dress. "Love is a luxury we can't afford," Victoria said. "Isabella's sentimentality has made her a threat to everything I've built, and your misguided loyalty to her has now made you equally dangerous. I had hoped to spare you by sending you away to relatives in Europe, but you've made that impossible by discovering things that can't be allowed to leave this house." The threat was unmistakable, and Cordelia realized that her mother was prepared to kill her immediately to prevent the evidence from reaching authorities. Cordelia's only advantage was that Victoria still needed to maintain the appearance of respectability, which meant that another sudden death in the Beaumont family would attract unwanted attention unless it could be made to look accidental. "You can't kill both of us without people asking questions," Cordelia said, trying to keep her voice steady while calculating her options for escape. 2 daughters dying within days of each other would be impossible to explain, even for someone with your talent for manipulation. Victoria's smile was cold and satisfied. "Who said anything about killing you immediately? You and Isabella will be traveling together to the sanatorium, where you'll both suffer from the same mysterious illness that requires increasingly strong medication. It's remarkable how many young women never recover from the kind of nervous conditions that run in families with histories of mental instability." Cordelia understood that Victoria had already planned for this contingency, arranging for both daughters to be eliminated at the remote sanatorium where their deaths would be attributed to natural causes and far from Charleston's social scrutiny. The plan was elegant, practical, and absolutely terrifying in its calculated efficiency. The sound of footsteps in the hallway indicated that James was approaching, probably summoned by Victoria to help deal with Cordelia's discovery of the evidence. Cordelia realized that she had only moments to act before she would be completely under Victoria and James's control, with no hope of saving herself or Isabella. Cordelia's escape was accomplished through a combination of desperate courage and pure luck. As Victoria moved to block her access to the study door, Cordelia threw the heavy journal at her mother's face, causing Victoria to stagger backward and drop whatever weapon she had been concealing in her dress. Cordelia grabbed as many of the copied journal pages as she could carry and ran from the study, shouting for the servants and hoping that witnesses might prevent Victoria from taking immediate violent action. The servants' response to Cordelia's screams revealed another aspect of Victoria's crimes that neither daughter had suspected. Instead of rushing to help, most of the household staff seemed to fade into the background, clearly aware that interfering in the Beaumont family's private business could be dangerous to their own safety. Only Sarah, the elderly cook who had worked for the family for 15 years, showed any willingness to help, and even she could only offer Cordelia a brief opportunity to escape from the mansion before Victoria and James could organize pursuit. Cordelia's flight from Charleston was accomplished on horseback, riding through the summer heat toward Savannah with the copied journal pages hidden in her clothing and the desperate hope that she could reach authorities before Victoria's influence could extend to block her accusations. Behind her, she could see riders in pursuit, but her horse was fresh and she had a crucial head start that might be enough to reach safety. The chase ended at the Savannah courthouse, where Cordelia's dramatic arrival, screaming accusations of murder and conspiracy, attracted enough attention to ensure that Victoria's agents couldn't simply eliminate her without creating a major scandal. The evidence Cordelia presented, combined with her detailed knowledge of Victoria's crimes, convinced local authorities to initiate an immediate investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of the Charleston poisoning ring. Victoria's arrest came within hours of Cordelia's escape, as law enforcement officials surrounded the Beaumont mansion and demanded access to search for evidence. Victoria maintained her composure and dignity even as investigators discovered arsenic hidden throughout the house, protesting her innocence with such convincing sincerity that some observers continued to doubt the charges against her. James's fate was more complex and ultimately more tragic. His complete psychological dependence on Victoria made him incapable of functioning independently once she was arrested, and his detailed confession revealed the extent to which she had manipulated and controlled him. The document he wrote while awaiting trial described his transformation from an honorable young man into an accessory to murder with heartbreaking clarity. "I believed I loved her," James wrote in his confession. "Victoria convinced me that everything she did was necessary to protect her family, that staying silent was the only way to keep Isabella and Cordelia safe from scandal and ruin. By the time I understood that Victoria intended to kill them regardless of my cooperation, I was so completely under her influence that escape seemed impossible. I tell myself that I would have found the courage to resist eventually, but in my darkest moments, I know that cowardice and desire made me her willing accomplice in unspeakable crimes." The trial of Victoria Beaumont became the most sensational legal case in South Carolina's history, drawing newspaper reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago. The courtroom was packed daily with Charleston's elite society, many of whom had known Victoria for years and still struggled to believe that the elegant hostess who had entertained them in her mansion was capable of systematic murder. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even hardened criminal investigators. Arsenic was discovered hidden throughout the Beaumont mansion, concealed in everything from Victoria's jewelry box to the lining of her favorite evening gloves. The victims' exhumed bodies showed clear signs of arsenic poisoning that had been missed during the original investigations, largely because Victorian-era medical knowledge of poison detection was limited and because Victoria's social status had deflected suspicion from her involvement in the deaths. Most damning of all was Victoria's own journal, recovered intact from the hidden compartment where Cordelia had found it. The entries, written in Victoria's meticulous handwriting, documented not just the murders she had already committed, but detailed plans for future killings that would have eliminated anyone who posed a threat to her security. The journal revealed Victoria to be a methodical killer who studied her victims' habits and weaknesses with scientific precision, calculating dosages and timing with the cold efficiency of a professional assassin. Victoria never admitted guilt, maintaining throughout the trial that she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by ungrateful daughters and ambitious prosecutors seeking to advance their careers by destroying a respectable widow's reputation. She claimed that her husband's death had been from natural causes, that the other victims had died in genuine accidents, and that the journal entries were fictional exercises she had written to explore the psychology of criminal behavior for a novel she had been planning to write. Her performance in the courtroom was masterful, combining dignity with just enough vulnerability to make some observers question whether such an elegant, refined woman could really be capable of the crimes described in the prosecution's case. Victoria dressed impeccably for each day of testimony, wore mourning jewelry that reminded everyone of her status as a widow, and spoke in the cultured tones of a woman who had been raised to embody the highest ideals of Southern womanhood. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony of survivors painted a clear picture of Victoria's methods and motivations. Isabella, having survived her mother's poisoning attempts, provided devastating testimony about Victoria's seduction of James and her systematic efforts to eliminate anyone who threatened her control of the family fortune. Cordelia's account of discovering the journal and Victoria's immediate violent response to that discovery convinced even Victoria's most vocal supporters that the charges against her were justified. The medical testimony was particularly compelling. Dr. Thomas Harriman, a physician from Atlanta who specialized in cases of suspected poisoning, explained to the jury exactly how arsenic affects the human body and demonstrated that the symptoms described in Victoria's journal matched perfectly with the conditions observed in the victims during their final illnesses. His explanation of how Victorian society's limited understanding of poison detection had allowed Victoria to operate undetected for years helped the jury understand how such extensive crimes could have gone unnoticed by Charleston's medical community. James's testimony was the most heartbreaking aspect of the trial. His confession detailed not just his own complicity in Victoria's crimes, but the psychological techniques she had used to transform him from an honorable young man into her willing accomplice. His description of Victoria's seduction methods, her systematic use of drugs to lower his resistance, and her gradual revelation of her criminal activities painted a picture of manipulation so sophisticated that even the prosecution acknowledged that James himself had been as much a victim as a perpetrator. "She made me believe that I was protecting Isabella by helping her," James testified, his voice breaking as he described how Victoria had convinced him that Isabella's death would save her from a worse fate at the hands of people who wanted to expose the family's secrets. Every step of the way, Victoria presented herself as a loving mother forced into terrible choices by circumstances beyond her control. By the time I realized that Isabella was never in danger from anyone except Victoria herself, I was so deep in her web of lies that I couldn't see any way to save Isabella without destroying myself. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Victoria received the death penalty, making her one of the few women to be sentenced to execution in South Carolina during the 19th century. James was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though he served only 8 before dying of tuberculosis in his cell, his health broken by guilt and the harsh conditions of the state penitentiary. Victoria's execution was scheduled for December 15, 1878, but she never lived to face the gallows. On the morning of December 10, she was found dead in her cell, apparently having ingested a fatal dose of arsenic that she had somehow obtained despite the precautions taken to prevent suicide attempts. Investigation revealed that she had been systematically scraping arsenic from the paint on her cell walls, collecting enough over several weeks to ensure a quick and relatively painless death. Her final letter, addressed to no one in particular, showed no remorse for her crimes and no concern for the families she had destroyed. Instead, it was a cold analysis of the mistakes she had made that led to her capture, written as though she were reviewing a business plan that had failed due to poor execution rather than moral considerations. "I regret nothing except my failure to anticipate Isabella's resourcefulness and Cordelia's intelligence," Victoria wrote in her distinctive handwriting. "A more careful approach to managing my daughters would have prevented the exposure of activities that were necessary for our family's survival. The weak sentimentality that prevented me from eliminating them sooner was my only real error in judgment." Isabella and Cordelia inherited what remained of the Beaumont estate after legal fees, victim compensation, and property seizures, but the inheritance was far smaller than anyone had expected. Victoria's apparent wealth had been largely illusory, supported by the money she had stolen from her victims and by elaborate financial schemes that collapsed once her crimes were exposed. The mansion itself was sold to pay debts, and the sisters used the remaining funds to relocate to California, where they could build new lives away from the scandal and notoriety that followed them in Charleston. Isabella never married, dedicating her life to helping other women escape dangerous domestic situations through a charity she founded in San Francisco. Her work with victims of family violence was groundbreaking for its time, and she became a respected advocate for legal reforms that would make it easier for women to seek protection from abusive relatives. She never spoke publicly about her experiences with Victoria, but those who worked closely with her said that her understanding of how manipulation and abuse operate within families was profound and deeply personal. Cordelia married a doctor she met in California and raised 4 children, but she maintained strict privacy about her family's history throughout her life. Her descendants learned about the Charleston poisoning case only after her death, when they discovered newspaper clippings and legal documents she had kept hidden for more than 50 years. Even then, the family chose to keep their connection to Victoria Beaumont secret, understanding that the stigma of such crimes could affect future generations. The Beaumont mansion was demolished in 1880, less than 2 years after Victoria's death. The new owners, a shipping family from Boston who had purchased the property at a significant discount, claimed they wanted to build something completely new rather than renovate a house so thoroughly associated with murder. Local legend suggested that the house was cursed, though the truth was simpler. No one wanted to live in a place where so many people had died under such horrific circumstances. The case of Victoria Beaumont raised disturbing questions about how many similar crimes might have gone undetected during an era when women were generally considered incapable of systematic violence and when medical knowledge of poison detection was limited. Victorian society's idealization of motherhood and feminine gentility created perfect cover for women like Victoria, who could use societal expectations about female behavior to deflect suspicion from their criminal activities. How many other loving mothers and devoted hostesses might have been hiding similar secrets behind facades of respectability and social grace? The question became particularly relevant as other suspicious cases began to emerge in the wake of Victoria's trial, with investigators across the South reviewing deaths that had previously been attributed to natural causes or accidents. The Charleston Police Department's files on the case remained classified for 40 years after Victoria's death, released only in 1918 when most of the people involved had died and the scandal no longer posed a threat to prominent families who had been connected to the investigation. Even then, many details were redacted or omitted entirely, leaving historians to piece together the full scope of Victoria's crimes from incomplete records and fragmentary evidence. Modern criminologists who have studied the case consider Victoria Beaumont to be one of the most sophisticated serial killers in American history, notable not just for the number of her victims but for the psychological manipulation she used to turn her own victims into accomplices in their destruction. Her ability to maintain perfect respectability while committing systematic murder demonstrates how social expectations and gender stereotypes can be weaponized by criminals who understand how to exploit society's assumptions about female behavior. The victims of Victoria's crimes were remembered differently by history. Her husband and the other men she murdered were largely forgotten, their deaths reduced to footnotes in accounts of her more dramatic crimes. James Whitmore became a cautionary tale about the dangers of weak character and moral compromise, though modern analysis suggests that he was as much a victim of psychological abuse as Isabella and Cordelia. Isabella and Cordelia Beaumont were celebrated as heroic figures who had survived their mother's attempts to kill them and had shown remarkable courage in exposing her crimes. Their successful escape from Charleston and their ability to build meaningful lives despite the trauma they had experienced became an inspiration for other women facing dangerous family situations. Isabella's work with domestic violence victims, in particular, was recognized as pioneering in its understanding of how abuse operates within families and its emphasis on practical support rather than moral judgment. The broader impact of the Charleston poisoning case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The extensive newspaper coverage of Victoria's trial educated the public about the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and the methods that could be used to detect it, making it more difficult for future poisoners to operate undetected. Medical schools began teaching more comprehensive courses about toxicology, and law enforcement agencies developed better protocols for investigating suspicious deaths, particularly those involving wealthy families whose social status might otherwise deflect scrutiny. The case also contributed to changing attitudes about women's capacity for violence and criminal behavior. While Victorian society had generally viewed women as naturally gentle and nurturing, Victoria's calculated cruelty demonstrated that gender was no guarantee of moral behavior. This recognition helped pave the way for more realistic approaches to criminal investigation that didn't automatically eliminate female suspects from consideration based on assumptions about feminine nature. Perhaps most importantly, the Charleston poisoning case highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority within families and the need for legal protections for family members who might be vulnerable to abuse. The fact that Victoria had been able to control and manipulate her daughters and future son-in-law so completely, using their love and trust against them, demonstrated how family relationships could be weaponized by those willing to exploit emotional bonds for criminal purposes. If this story has left you as disturbed as it's left us, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Stories like Victoria Beaumont's remind us that evil often wears the most respectable faces and that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most completely. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we're constantly uncovering buried crimes and forgotten scandals that powerful families have spent generations trying to hide. What do you think about Victoria's actions? Was she a desperate woman driven to extremes by financial pressure and social expectations, or was she simply a cold-blooded killer who used society's assumptions about motherhood to mask her true nature? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you've heard similar stories from your own area. Next week, we'll be exploring another case of family secrets and hidden murder, this time from the mining towns of Colorado, where a respected businessman used his position in the community to cover up crimes that make Victoria Beaumont's activities look almost restrained by comparison. You won't want to miss it, because the evidence we've uncovered suggests that the case we thought we understood was actually just the tip of a much darker iceberg. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth about these buried crimes needs to be told, no matter how disturbing it might be. We'll see you next time, when we dig deeper into America's hidden history of family violence and covered-up murder. The legacy of Victoria Beaumont continues to fascinate criminologists and historians more than a century after her death. Her case is studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of how intelligence, social status, and gender expectations can be used to commit extensive crimes while maintaining public respectability. The techniques she used to manipulate her victims and deflect suspicion have been identified in numerous other cases, suggesting that her methods were not unique but part of a broader pattern of domestic violence and financial crime that has been largely hidden from historical view. The house that replaced the Beaumont mansion still stands today on Rutledge Avenue, though the current owners have no connection to the original tragedy. Visitors to Charleston's Garden District often walk past the property without knowing about the crimes that were committed on that site, though local historians occasionally organize tours that include discussion of the case for those interested in the city's darker history. The sealed third-floor windows that we mentioned at the beginning of this story were actually part of renovations completed in the 1920s, when city officials decided that certain evidence related to Victoria's crimes should be permanently preserved but never displayed publicly. What exactly is contained in those sealed rooms remains a mystery, though property records suggest that the space was converted into an archive for documents and physical evidence that were deemed too disturbing or sensitive for public access. Some researchers have speculated that Victoria's journal contained information about other crimes or criminals that could have implicated prominent Charleston families in activities they preferred to keep secret. Others believe that the sealed rooms contain evidence of additional victims whose deaths were never officially connected to Victoria's activities, but which investigators suspected were part of her larger pattern of criminal behavior. Whatever secrets remain hidden behind those bricked-over windows, they serve as a permanent reminder that even the most respectable families and beautiful homes can conceal histories of violence and betrayal that would shock those who see only their carefully maintained exteriors. The Charleston Garden District deception remains one of the most chilling examples of how domestic violence and financial crime can be disguised as family devotion, and how the people we trust most completely can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger to our lives and well-being.